There is a novel so dangerous that its own country refused to publish it for 34 years. A book written by a Russian author, in exile, about obsession, forbidden desire, and the lies we tell ourselves to justify the unforgivable. Vladimir Nabokov called it his best work. The Soviet state called it a crime. And in 2002, a Russian filmmaker did something that neither Kubrick nor Hollywood had ever attempted. He took that novel back to the land it was forbidden from, back to the birch forests of St. Petersburg, back to the country of its author's birth, and he rebuilt the entire story from the ground up in Russian, with Russian names, a Russian village, and a young Russian actress at its center. Russkaya Lolita. This is its story. Before we get into the film itself, consider the situation director Armen Oganezov had placed himself in. He was working in post-Soviet Russia in the early 2000s, a country that had only legally allowed Nabokov's novel to exist on its own soil for the first time just 13 years earlier. A country where the word Lolita was still electric, still dangerous, still carrying the weight of banned literature, political suppression, and a wound that decades of silence had never fully healed. And Oganezov wanted to film it there, in that wound, but here is what makes this story genuinely interesting. He didn't attempt a copy of Kubrick's famous 1962 version with its theatrical wit and careful restraint. He didn't follow Adrian Lyne's 1997 psychological portrait, with Jeremy Irons dismantling himself in every frame. He built something entirely new. He changed the names. He changed the era. He changed the country. He placed the story inside a wooden dacha in a forested village north of St. Petersburg and populated it with characters whose names were lifted directly from Russian children's literature. The question is, did that decision produce something of genuine artistic value? Or did it simply take one of the most complex novels in literary history and strip it of everything that made it extraordinary? To answer that, we need to go back further, much further. Vladimir Nabokov was born in St. Petersburg in 1899 into one of Imperial Russia's most distinguished aristocratic families. He was a child of privilege, a prodigy who spoke 3 languages before he was 10, and a young man who seemed destined for a life of literary greatness inside the country that had shaped him. The Bolshevik Revolution ended that destiny in a single winter. In 1919, the Nabokov family fled. Vladimir would spend the rest of his adult life in Berlin, then Paris, then the United States, a permanent exile. A Russian mind living inside foreign languages, always writing toward the homeland he would never see again. He wrote Lolita in English between 1949 and 1954. It was the story of Humbert Humbert, a cultivated, manipulative European intellectual who becomes obsessively fixated on a 12-year-old girl he calls Lolita. The entire novel is told through Humbert's voice, polished, self-justifying, deeply unreliable, a defense that is, on close reading, a confession. It was, Nabokov later said, the most difficult thing he had ever written, and also his finest achievement. No American publisher would touch it. It was finally released in 1955 by Olympia Press in Paris, a publisher known for its willingness to handle texts that the mainstream world refused. It was immediately banned in France, then in Britain, then in several other countries across Europe. And in Nabokov's homeland, Soviet authorities classified it as anti-Soviet propaganda and suppressed it entirely. The novel that would make its author one of the most celebrated writers of the 20th century was not legally available in Russia until 1989. 34 years of silence. When the Soviet Union collapsed and cultural censorship began to lift, Russian readers encountered Nabokov's work as part of a vast, overwhelming rediscovery of everything that had been hidden from them. The novel arrived in Russia not as a foreign import, but as a homecoming. A stolen inheritance finally returned. It landed with enormous force. It was scandalous. It was literary. And it was written by a Russian writer who had never been permitted to belong to Russia. By the early 2000s, 2 landmark Western adaptations had already entered the cultural record. Stanley Kubrick's 1962 film shot in England, with James Mason's haunted theatrical Humbert and a screenplay Nabokov himself worked on before Kubrick largely rewrote it. A masterwork of suggestion and dark comedy. and Adrian Lyne's 1997 version with Jeremy Irons in perhaps the most psychologically exhausting performance of his career, and Dominique Swain as a Lolita who felt genuinely, disturbingly real. A film that struggled to find a distributor for 2 years because American studios were terrified of it. Both were extraordinary. Both were definitively Western in their sensibility. Neither had ever attempted what Oganezov was about to attempt. Armen Oganezov was not a household name in Russian cinema. He was working in the independent film sector, the wild, commercially uncertain, artistically unpredictable space that opened up in Russia after the Soviet system collapsed, and nobody was quite sure what the rules were anymore. His previous work had placed him in territory that mainstream Russian studios avoided. He understood how to operate on the margins, how to make a film that existed in the space between genres, between categories, between what was tolerated and what was not. For Russkaya Lolita, he made a specific and deliberate creative declaration. The opening credits of the film describe it as based on the motifs from a scandalous novel by a famous Russian writer. Not an adaptation, not a remake. Motifs. That single word tells you everything about what Oganezov was attempting. He was not trying to compete with Kubrick. He was not trying to outdo Lyne. He was doing something structurally different, extracting the emotional and thematic architecture of the source material and rebuilding it inside a specifically Russian frame. The American Humbert became Gennady, a Russian writer, renting a room in a summer dacha. The suburban American setting became Komarovo, a quiet village on the Karelian Isthmus north of St. Petersburg, known for its birch forests and its particular northern melancholy. And the character of Lolita Dolores Hayes in Nabokov's original became Alisa, nicknamed Lishanak, Little Fox, a name borrowed directly from Buratino, the beloved Russian reimagining of Pinocchio that every Russian child of the Soviet era knew by heart. That was not a careless choice. Oganezov was embedding his film in the fabric of Russian childhood literature, giving his Lolita a name that carried innocence, playfulness, and familiarity to every Russian viewer who heard it. And he chose to film in Komarovo for a reason that went even deeper than the visual atmosphere. Komarovo is the village where Anna Akhmatova, one of the greatest poets of the Soviet suppression era, a woman who spent decades having her own work banned and her friends executed, spent her final years. A filmmaker who places his version of the most suppressed novel in Russian literary history in the village of the most suppressed poet in Russian literary history is making an argument. Whether you agree with it or not, that is an argument. Here's the fact that defines this film in the history of Nabokov on screen. Valeria Nemchenko was 15 years old when she was cast in the lead role. Oganezov made deliberate choices about what she would and would not portray. Her Alisa stops short of explicit content, but she is emotionally present in a way that makes the film's central dynamic uncomfortable in exactly the way Nabokov intended. Her Alisa is not passive. She is curious, persistent, and fully aware of the effect she creates. That quality, the question of whether Lolita has genuine agency or whether the appearance of agency is itself the predator's most damaging lie, is the tension Oganezov inherits from the source material and never quite resolves. Russkaya Lolita was the beginning and the end of Nemchenko's film career. One more short film, 2 years later. Then silence. A single performance, no follow-up, just the film, sitting in the archive, asking the question it never answers. The film found its audience through the home video market VHS copies, subtitled versions, word of mouth crossing borders quietly and without official distribution. Internationally, it developed a genuine cult following, split cleanly into 2 camps. Those who came to it through the novel found something unexpectedly considered in its Russian transposition. The Komarovo setting, the Akhmatova connection, the Essenin poem woven into the narrative, not the hallmarks of a cynical production. The decisions of a filmmaker who had actually thought about what the story meant when returned to Russian soil. The opposing camp was equally firm. For them, the film lacked the psychological scaffolding, the unreliable narration, the dark irony, the moral architecture that gave Kubrick's and Lyne's versions their justification. Context without craft, in their view. One review calls it blasphemy to the great novel. Another calls Nemchenko's performance the most convincing portrayal of the character ever filmed. Both responses are legitimate. Both reflect something true about what this film attempted. The most significant thing about Russkaya Lolita is not the content, not the casting, not the controversy. It is what the film represents as a cultural act. Nabokov was a Russian writer exiled from Russia. His masterpiece was composed in English, set in America, suppressed in his homeland for 34 years, and eventually returned to Russian readers as a translation, his own words, made foreign by the journey they were forced to take. Oganezov's film is an attempt to undo that journey. Russian birch forests instead of American highways. Russian poetry instead of English literary allusion. Russian names that carry the specific weight of Soviet childhood memory. The filming location alone makes the argument. Anna Akhmatova, suppressed by the same state that suppressed Nabokov, who spent years forbidden to publish while watching her circle destroyed, spent her final years in Komarovo. Oganezov filmed the most banned novel in Russian literary history in the village of the most banned poet in Russian literary history. In post-Soviet Russia's brief window of cultural openness before the controls tightened, again, this was a filmmaker reaching into the archive of everything that had been taken and asking, what does it look like when we bring it home? Vladimir Nabokov never went home. He died in 1977 in a hotel room in Montreux, 78 years old, 58 years gone from the city where he was born, surrounded by index cards, still writing. The novel that made him immortal was written in a language that was not his first, about a country that was not his own, by a man who had lost everything native to him. In 2002, a director stood in a birch forest outside St. Petersburg and tried, imperfectly, to bring one version of that story back. The film is flawed, the attempt is genuine, and in the long history of what Russia has taken from its writers and what its artists have tried to reclaim, that distinction matters. Russkaya Lolita is the story of a country trying to recognize itself in a mirror it was never allowed to look into. Before you go, I want to ask you something directly. Does the cultural framework Oganezov built into this film, the Akhmatova village, the Russian names, the post-Soviet setting elevate it beyond what it appears to be on the surface? Or does context, no matter how carefully constructed, have limits that cannot be crossed? Tell me in the comments. I want to know where you land on this. And if you have additional research, corrections, or production details that didn't make it into this documentary, drop them below. The comment section is where the real history gets written. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden, suppressed, and deliberately forgotten corners of world cinema is what you're here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell.